Chapter 22. 79 Days After. I'd been in the hospital for 3 days, and the night my mom brought me home, when I asked what happened, she called it a mishap. You were running, she said, and they couldn't stop in time. A mishap. She pulled the covers up to my chin as if I were a child, and ran her palm over the wrinkles in the blanket. I noticed her nail-bitten fingers shaking, and then she leaned over the nightstand, poured 2 pills into her palm, placed them on my tongue, brought a glass of water to my lips, and said, "Just sleep." In the morning I woke up. I woke to the cadence of sidewalk traffic outside the house. Dogs barking, buses stopping and starting, voices laughing, and there, just behind the noise, somewhere a few miles away, I imagined I heard the ocean. "You're awake?" My mother stood in the doorway. She wore jeans and a red V-neck sweater, and was barefoot, with her hair pulled back in a ponytail, no makeup, but somehow more beautiful than I'd ever seen her look in a long time. I raised my hand to my face, the burning having shifted from red to pink, but a rich pink still, and she said, "Don't. It'll be sore to touch for a while now." My fingers ran over the ply of hospital gauze, and underneath my skin throbbed. "Road rash," she told me as she sat on the bed, nudging my hand away from my cheek. She smelled like the lavender lotion she used, and a bit like vanilla too. My grandmother having taught her the same trick she taught me. "It'll heal before you know it." My left leg was set in a cast that ended mid-thigh, and I wore a matching cast from my right wrist to the elbow. My mother told me the pill bottles on the nightstand were pain medicine and antibiotics for my abrasions. The car that hit me, the couple heading north towards Sonoma who didn't see me run past the beach chalet and push off the path, was the second half of the accident that broke my leg, shattered my wrist, bruised my shoulder, and left me covered with severe lacerations on on the right side of my face from skidding over the highway. I was the first I was the first half of the accident. I hadn't been wearing headphones with the music cranked, and I wasn't talking on the cell phone, typical excuses for that kind of accident. There wasn't a reason in the world that I darted in front of the car, not one that made sense at least. I'd simply been running too fast, distracted by my thoughts. In the end, it had almost been my own fault. It had mostly been my own fault. "I'm so sorry," I said. "I don't know what happened." She adjusted the pillows so I could sit up. "It was someone else," she said. "In Dolores Park. I told you last night, but I didn't know if you remembered. Someone else that was not him, which meant he was still missing." "I was thinking of him," I told her, "when I was running, thinking of all the things I didn't like about him when he was here." She smiled. "Like the toothpicks? The way he used them at the restaurant instead of waiting until we weren't in public? Most people use them in the car on the drive home." I'd forgotten that, I told her. I leaned for the cup of water on the nightstand and saw the guitar string bracelet and the piece of glass from the job site resting next to it. "The hospital gave me the bracelet," she said, "and I found the glass in the wash. For some reason I thought it might be important." I picked up the piece of glass and rubbed it between my fingers. "I realized I'm angry, you know. I've been working so hard to distract myself from missing him that I didn't notice how angry I am. At him for letting it happen and for leaving me behind. And at me for not being able to find him. At I hesitated. "I've been angry at you," I said, "and I'm not even sure why." She'd cleaned my room while I was at the hospital, and my books from the library about 1906 were stacked on my reading chair along with the photography book from the art exhibit. She also organized the earthquake DVDs on my desk and picked up all the clothes from my floor. "You've been so worried," she said, drawing my eyes back to her, "about disasters and emergency plans, all these what ifs that I don't have an answer for. It's not healthy, Callum. It's not fair. And I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to stop you from worrying so much." "It's okay," I told her. But she said, "No, it's not. And I know I've put a lot of pressure on you. School, track, college prep, and this thing with your dad, it's an impossible thing for someone your age to accept." I'd gone back to the library and made copies of the photo. I'd blown it up 1, 2, 300% so I could look closer at the man who looked just like him. And I wondered if she'd seen the copies when she'd cleaned my room. The sheets of blurred images tucked inside the book. I wondered if she'd seen him there too, or if I was the only one. "Being a parent is the most difficult thing," she said. "It's like playing with magic. There's so many things you have to trick yourself into believing." "Like what?" I opened my palm and held it out to her so that she could take the piece of glass, which she did. "Mainly, you have to trick yourself into thinking you have some kind of control, that you can protect your child." She held the glass up to the light, and I wondered if she could feel what I felt when I held it, the soft vibration and warmth. But it's there all along, that truth that you can't stop bad things from happening. There's too much of it, the possibility of pain. But as a parent, you have to convince yourself that you can prevent your child from having to face it, that you can guarantee they'll make it through unharmed. She shook her head. "The one great lie parents must tell themselves every single day." She put the piece of glass back on the nightstand. "Because if you don't believe you can protect them, if you don't think there's a chance, then being a parent could be an impossible thing. It would be senseless, an impossible and unbearable thing." We listened to the sound of the ringing down the hall, and I realized she turned the volume off on my phone in my room. Eventually, the machine picked up in her bedroom, my father's voice still, the same recording I'd played a million times when she wasn't home. It was the only way I could still hear him. "I miss him," I said. "His voice, his everything." "I know you do." And then I realize I don't have a monopoly on missing him. And I know it's been just as hard on you as it's been on me. He was my best friend, Kelly, and I'm guessing he was your best friend too. I realized that even though losing my dad was by far the most terrible thing I could have had to endure, I had no idea what it would be like to lose a husband, that one person you picked to be part of your family, your greatest ally. I looked to my mother and she and knew she'd been just as lost as I had those past months. "But we can't keep doing this," she said as she ran her fingers over my cheek, pressing lightly on the gauze. "Running in circles like this. I could have lost you." She told me, her eyes filling with tears even though I could tell she was trying not to cry. "That's not something I'd be able to handle. I couldn't go on if something. It's just not an option," she said finally. "I miss him, but I've been missing you too." She kept going. "I know I'm not supposed to admit it and that I should be stronger, but I need you. I need you to be here, to be present. We won't survive if we keep shutting each other out." I thought of all the hours I'd spent practicing the with nothing right after my father disappeared, the long shifts she'd taken at the library, and the afternoons I'd spent running in the park, the brunches at Squat and Gobble, and the meetings with my friends at the cafes. Her, silently passing me in the hallway, quietly drifting through the house. And all that time I'd spent looking for him, never once explaining to her what I was doing, not once asking for help. You can't keep worrying about things that may or may not happen. Studying disasters from 100 years ago, she said, he wouldn't want that. I know it, and you know it too. She hadn't found the photo then, or if she hadn't seen him there. My mother believed I was reading about the earthquake and watching the videos because I'd been worried it could happen to us. Maybe I had been. So I'm thinking that's what we use to make it okay, she said. Us missing him so much, knowing that we're both fighting the same thing, even if we're missing him in different ways. What if we use that common ground to build on something new, to work on us, our relationship? Her eyes were pleading. It was one of those moments that are so horribly beautiful, an unbearable truth there in the middle of everything, because he was gone. We needed each other more than we'd ever needed each other before. We're going to be okay, she said. A terrible sadness poured over me because what she meant to say was, we're going to be okay without him. I wanted to believe her. Even as my heart was breaking, I wanted to believe that she was right. It took over a week for my shoulders to heal enough so I could start using crutches to get around the house. And I mostly spent the time holed up in my bedroom, sleeping and watching old movies with my mom. I read all the back issues of Rolling Stone I'd been ignoring since I started studying the earthquake. Then I read my dad's copies of National Geographic, which actually weren't boring at all. I read about Lake Powell in the southwest and about the Irrawaddy River in Myanmar. I studied photos of 1600-year-old mummy unearthed in Peru and thought of all the other boats or bones or relics that might be buried under our city. Eventually, I ran out of magazines, and my mom brought me the stack of college catalogs she'd been collecting, just in case. So I looked them over and tried to imagine hanging out at the beach near UC Santa Barbara or going to concerts at the House of Blues near UCLA. I also reread all the Habitat for Humanity pamphlets and talked my mom into spending an afternoon on the computer with me, researching different countries where they had programs for long-term volunteers. Only the safe spots, she said. No war zones, no drug lords or prostitution rings, she said. She had told me, kind of being serious, but also laughing when I rolled my eyes. It felt like an unspoken truce, like we'd both agreed to consider all the options. And then, eventually and inevitably, I pulled out the photography book and looked at the picture I'd found my father trapped inside. I'd studied the image, the building with their fronts ripped off and strewn in the city, piles of wood and plaster spilling into the road. At the top of the hill, a group of women in floor-length dresses stood below a lamp post, their hands perched on their waists with their backs towards the camera. On the other side of the street, a handful of men sat in a collection of folding chairs, also peering down the hill at the tall building on fire. They wore dark-colored suits and old-fashioned hats. Sacramento Street near Powell. And the man, a blurry silhouette, impossible to know his height or the true angles of his face, but undeniably familiar. I thought of my mom then, of her damp eyes when she'd said she could have lost me. It's a treacherous and wondrous thing to be needed, to be loved by and linked to another person's happiness so severely. And it had been completely my fault, the car accident. It hadn't been a mishap at all. I'd run into oncoming traffic because I'd been locked inside my head, inside myself, and my mother deserved better than that. She deserved a daughter who would work as hard as possible to keep that need and loving safe, who would protect that back and forth reliance on family. I looked at the photo and ran my fingers over the man's face, the grainy, cracked pavement at his feet, and his eyes tilted toward the city streets. It has to end here, I said.